So, Luke, as your book is titled Goliath's Curse, The History and Future of Societal Collapse, this book came out just a couple months ago, just kind of finished reading it for the podcast. And as you talk about societal collapse going back thousands of years, when you talk about civilizations and a societal collapse, it could be collapsing in years. A society could collapse in decades, or maybe a society collapse in centuries. So I guess the question is, are we living through a collapse right now? But is it just so slow that we don't even know that we're living through a societal collapse? Or is it obvious? I mean, you're in the UK, you're in Cambridge, I'm in the US, so we're different parts of the world. So maybe we're experiencing things differently. You must get asked this question all the time. Like, are we living through one right now, right? I mean, that's kind of the gist of the question.
It's a difficult question to answer, if not potentially impossible. Many of the feedback loops which push you towards a collapse may just be unknowable or very difficult to perceive and see. I don't think we are. At the very least, I don't think we're past a point of no return. There's certainly countries which appear to be declining. So, for instance, in the US, things like life expectancy, and I think at least until recently, human height was decreasing. It's becoming less and less democratic. But also the difficulty here is that many collapses today, or many huge potential collapse scenarios, could happen very suddenly. The world could be going very well until suddenly you have a nuclear war one day, and then suddenly collapse is rather abrupt. Hence, there's an entire kind of realm of potential collapse scenarios, which it doesn't really matter even if you are going well. But as to whether we're collapsing today, I don't think so. I don't think things are that dire or grim. I mean, if you look at the UK, sure, things are becoming more autocratic in some ways. It's definitely a cost of living crisis. Is it a collapse? A situation in which most power structures are totally crumbling, contracting, and fragmenting? I don't think so. Not yet, at least.
Have you ever read the book, The Fourth Turning?
No.
Kind of the gist of it is that there's like these 80 to 100 year cycles, and there's four phases or four cycles, which is why it's called the fourth turning. But basically the first would be like the high point of society. Then you have an awakening where you kind of, push back on, like the establishment, the man, so to speak. You have an unraveling, and then you have a crisis, and then it goes back, to the, goes from the crisis back to the high point. And I guess he postulates that 2008, the start of the financial crisis, was actually the start of the fourth phase, the crisis. So we're kind of at the tail end of that right now, because he, kind of postulates, I think these cycles each last about 15 to 25 years. So if you want to extrapolate the 25 years out further, that'd be like, I don't know, 2033, something like that, right? And I guess I kind of agree with that. I feel like, at least, I'm in my 40s, and I would say this is probably the low point of, or I guess I shouldn't say the low point, but I'd say it's kind of like the most kind of crazy, so to speak, that the world's been since I've been alive.
So I haven't heard of it, and it's difficult to say that I haven't read the book. I'm fairly skeptical of these kind of cyclical theories off the bat, particularly if they have a really good set of empirical evidence or really clear mechanisms to justify them. The closest, and this is also partially because when you look across the great realm of different societal collapses and state formations, there's a lot of variety to them. There are some, and some I cover in the book, for instance, where a city or a farming community starts off and they're pretty egalitarian. Then as soon as they start to become hierarchical and centralized, they fall apart really quickly. And generally speaking, it's usually when things start to become more centralized and hierarchical, the empire, the imperial golden age, that's when we start to talk about, I guess, what he would call the first turning. But in these cases, they collapse at the first turning. Hence, I'm a bit skeptical. The only real cyclical theory I would adhere to roughly would be what's called structural demographic theory by Peter Turchin. That's quite different because Peter's both a historian, a modeler. He's got an incredible amount of empirical evidence behind him, and additionally has really clear mechanisms as to why you see these cyclical patterns happen over and over again. But notably, even in Peter's model, it doesn't always result in collapse. You have these cycles that tend to result in crisis, but it's not always that things just fall apart. Indeed, if we have this like kind of four-stage model of roughly 100 or 80 years, the Byzantine Empire lasted 1,000. So there's kind of question marks as to how applicable these things are. And most importantly, I think we still have agency. Even if there are structural factors that push us towards decline, and I point towards a whole bunch in the book, mainly wealth inequality, it doesn't mean you can't change that.
Yeah, you're talking about Peter Turchin. I mean, you mentioned him in your book, Goliath's Curse, as well. But I mean, he basically was the one that talked a lot about elite over production or overpopulation. Too many elites, basically, is a big chunk of his theory. I mean, you do talk about that. So you do actually think we have too many elites in 2025 globally?
It's a combination of too many elites relative to high status positions. It's the idea of elite overproduction. Is basically too many elites given a limited number of high status positions, like being president, for instance. And the one that I kind of differ from Peter on a couple of regards here. One is that I think Peter probably has a bit too capacious an understanding of elite, where he often points to people with PhDs, for instance, being elites. Well, for me, and the way we talk about this in history, it tends to be the top 1% of decision makers in the world, which tend to be usually the wealthy. I find it very difficult to point towards someone who has a PhD but is jobless and living in a share house and call them elite. The other key difference here is that while Peter talks about elite competition, so you have lots of elites, there's a kind of musical chairs going with high status positions with the thrones, and hence they have to compete. I think there's almost just as much elite factionalism. There's a lot of cooperation as well. Donald Trump has a huge number of other elites he's excluding cooperating with in order to maintain power. And likewise, the coups throughout history and warlord overtakings, they tend to be a whole bunch of elites working together. So it's competition, but it's also cooperation. It's what I call factionalism. But that is an area where there's very clear evidence that does tend to happen in a pretty predictable, borderline cyclical fashion.
I guess the definition of elites would be pretty... Everyone kind of has a different definition, but having a PhD doesn't make you an elite, I would say. I mean, what's the percentage of PhDs that are either unemployed or underemployed? Probably pretty high. And then if you get a PhD from some middling state school, at least in the US, I'm not sure how much cachet that has versus having a PhD from Cambridge, or having from say Harvard or Princeton or Yale, or one of those, I got a PhD from Middle Tennessee State and on gender studies of the Mohican language in the 13th century. Like, okay, good luck with. I'm pretty sure you're not an elite, but I guess that it's open to interpretation for Peter Turchin.
Yeah, particularly in comparison to, say, for instance, a billionaire. But if you are looking at people who can have a sufficient power to basically push society towards a crisis point, I think that does limit your definition much more.
In your book, you basically talk about there's power comes in 4 forms. You have political, economic, violent, and informational. I think in today's day and age, if you're elite, quote unquote, we're talking about elite, if you have money, well, then you can buy political. You can, that gives you, you basically can buy the informational, aka media, which means you can market to have a campaign to give you political power. And then if you have political power, well, especially if you're, president or dictator or something, then you can control the military, which would give you the ability to create violence, which means that you would have all 4. Having a PhD but potentially gives you 0. Maybe you're 150,000 in student debt, which actually means you have minus power, but that's a separate conversation.
Yeah. So this idea of the different sources of social power is riffing off a sociologist called Michael Mann, who did a seminal set of books called The Source of Social Power. Now, I modify and expand upon those, but I think this is a crucial insight. We often use power in a pretty loose kind of way and equate it just to money. Yet, one of the key things I argue in the book is that different sources of power are often fungible. They can be changed and translated. And the most fungible by far is economic power, the ability to control resources. And that's what really changes roughly 11,000 years ago. Once you start to get things like grain, resources that are easily seen, stolen, and stored, is prior to that, you could, for instance, be let's say, an excellent facilitator and hunter, someone who has a large amount of prestige in their group, is taken seriously, is potentially even considered to be a kind of quasi-chief of sorts. Yet you don't have the resources to, say, for instance, buy people to buy your own army. You don't have the resources to easily pass down to the next generation through a trust fund, for instance. Once you have money, once you have any kind of economic power, you can suddenly start to make it intergenerational, and you can start to much more easily transfer it between things. So that's the one that worries me most today, is essentially plutocracy, people who control resources. And when you look at democratic backsliding, that seems to be one of the key culprits. People like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, it's pretty clear they're translating their economic power into other forms of power. Jeff Bezos owns Audible, Twitch, and the Washington Post, alongside obviously Amazon, while Elon Musk has taken over Twitter with a very clear purpose in mind. They're trying to control information power. And apart from that, they're obviously highly involved with surveillance capitalism, controlling other sorts of information to improve their business model. And they're getting increasingly involved in politics. Elon Musk, in many ways, helped Trump win the election and then actually took a key styling role in the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. And this is the key thing, is that once you start to get increasing wealth inequality, it spills into those other forms of power, creating often more autocratic states, but also more extractive institutions, where essentially this society becomes increasingly top-heavy across each of those forms of power. And that is exactly what we are experiencing today.
You have the Goliath. That's kind of your word for like civilization that essentially has kind of been, I guess you could say, kind of like top heavy and more fragile over years, I guess you could say. I mean, I guess actually I'll just let you. I mean, you can kind of, I mean, you're the person who coined it, right? So like, since we're talking about Goliath, why don't you explain what Goliath is and give us the elevator pitch thesis of your book?
When I first started writing the book, I faced the question of what is collapsing. And most people would say civilization. Yet when you try to define civilization, the results tend to be pretty bad. Most definitions are either incredibly vague or capacious, or just don't make much sense. One of the most popular is a set of different characteristics that civilizations have. So Gordon Childe, an Australian archaeologist from the 1930s, had a very famous list of 10 markers, including things like long-distance trade, which technically all hunter-gatherers have, or writing, which the Incan Empire, stretching all the way from Argentina to Chile, did not have. So the checklist doesn't really work. There's other ones like having an advanced culture, which is about as capacious as it is biased against indigenous peoples. But in short, none of them are really pointing towards a precise definition showing a common feature across all these different case studies that we think of as civilization. And it's important to remember that civilization has always been a term of propaganda. Whether it's the Roman Empire, the Incan Empire, or different Chinese dynasties, they always had a sense of there's us civilized people, and we are superior to those who are uncivilized beyond our borders. And even our current use of the term civilized tends to mean people who are courteous, moderated, have restraints, etc. And that all derives to the Latin root of civilitas, which the Romans had. When you actually look across the archaeological record, when you look at the very first states of the world, for instance, Uruk in Mesopotamia, the first dynasty of Egypt, Cahokia in North America, or the Shah dynasty in China, when you actually try to look at what are the commonalities, it tends to be things like human sacrifice. Every single one is preceded by large-scale warfare and increased violence. And most importantly, they all tend to be marked by having a dominance hierarchy, a system in which one individual, or a small number of individuals, are ranked above others and have superior access to resources. In short, you start to have kings, you start to have military commanders. We as a species start to resemble the hierarchies of chimpanzees and the harems of gorillas more than what we used to look like. And that's what I call Goliath, is basically a set of these dominant hierarchies. That's what really changes when we talk about civilization. And a Goliath is not just simply the state, it's not just the king and the empire. The Roman Empire, or the Roman Goliath, was not just the actual empire itself. It was also the distinctions we have between master and slave, man and woman, and even citizen and non-citizen, for instance. So it's the collection of those different dominance hierarchies across different forms of social power. That, in short, is the Goliath. And the elevator pitch of the book is that Goliaths contain the seeds of their own demise. They are cursed. This is primarily because wealth inequality tends to increase over time within these Goliaths. That's for two reasons. One is once you have power, it's more easy to get more power. And the second is that things like land, stocks, and shares tend to increase much more quickly in value than wages do. And hence, there's a widening gulf between the rich and the poor. As mentioned, this isn't just wealth inequality, it spills into other forms of power, making it kind of an increasingly top-heavy society. And that tends to trigger a whole bunch of knock-on effects. Inequality itself tends to lead to higher socio-political violence and even higher rates of things like environmental degradation. As you get a more top-heavy society, you start to get a lot of people in charge who are homogenous. They're going to make worse decisions in general, but importantly, they also have a huge vested in status quo and hence aren't willing to address oncoming disasters. On top of that, as we mentioned, when you get lots and lots of elites together, competing for different high status positions, that tends to lead to a lot of conflict. Things like coups, war takeovers. And as you're drawing more resources from everyday people, you start to get a cost of living crisis, what Peter Turchin would call popular immiseration. And on top of all that, as you start to get lots of different elites competing for power, you start to get an increasing demand for resources, which often leads to further afield conquests, imperial overexpansion, but also more and more environmental destruction. Whether it be depleting mines, for instance, as happened before Rome with silver mines in Spain, or, for instance, just simply trying to till the fields and farm too hard and heavy until eventually the soil is degraded. But in many ways, most of the typical theories we have around collapse can all be traced back to the underlying driver of increasing wealth inequality and concentration of power. That's what makes states more fragile over time until eventually they're toppled by a combination of different disasters like climate change, disease, and invaders.
I'm kind of talking about inequality, which is probably the biggest theme of your book. But if you look at the rich of the was it what year did the Forbes richest people come out? It's like the early 1980s, and there was something like 20 billionaires on that list. And now there's over 3,000 billionaires. But I think the biggest common factor was that was pre-internet. And at the time, of course, you had Pablo Escobar, who was on the list. At one point, he was like the richest person in the world, which is pretty interesting. You know, he's selling coke from Colombia. But anyways, I think the internet really, though, created scalability. I mean, it's the reason why like investors love tech, right? It's versus a brick and mortar store. And I think the internet really created a lot of billionaires because you have such scalability instead of having to have, I mean, how many, I don't know, how many customers can a typical business have? Well, the internet, you can have billions. You can have customers in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in the US, and you add in a few more servers. So yeah, while your costs go up a little bit, they don't go up that much compared to like, oh, we need to provide Coca-Cola or Pepsi and actually build more plants and have supply chains and all these. So, I mean, I think a lot of like the inequality, while the internet did provide, you know, the quote unquote democratizing information and flows and things like that when it first came out, it also created avenues for people to not just get rich, but become like gajillionaires, which we never really had before. And I think we're kind of in this point where we really don't know how to kind of deal with it or handle it because it's just so new. We never actually had this happen before where you had almost infinite scalability.
I would say in general, technology changes our capacity to create inequality, but it's not the driver of inequality per se. There was a good paper which came out last year on long-run wage inequality in China, basically looking at how has inequality changed over the last 2,000 years in China. And one of the key things they point towards is that a key driver initially tends to be new technology, basically creating larger yields, more surplus resources. But eventually that's always increasingly co-opted by a small number of elites, which obviously leads to growing inequality until eventually you have some kind of state collapse or a dynastic crisis, which tends to level inequality. And this is a common feature, not just in Chinese history, but across imperial realms. Peter Turchin would talk about this in terms of the wealth pump, that you have a system in which resources are transferred from the bottom of society to the top. And in many ways, it's not just the wealth pump, it's a pump of all different types of resources and power. And the key thing here is this tends to happen regardless of what types of technologies you have, but technology can massively amplify it. And hence, I think I'd agree that the internet did enable larger concentrations of wealth, maybe even accelerated the cycle a little bit. I suspect we still would have had growing inequality even without the internet. It's notable that when you look across the inequality statistics globally, at least, wealth inequality is basically leveled during the Great Wars. So the World Wars, what people call the Great Compression. And it starts to creep up back in the 1970s before the internet comes online. But I think you're right. It provides a whole new avenue for obviously new types of business ventures. Notably, I think it's 5 out of the top 10 firms across the world in terms of market capitalization are all surveillance capitalist firms. Things like Amazon, Apple, Google, Meta, etc. They all rely upon the internet and they rely upon harvesting data en masse and selling it forwards. But the key thing here is that technology shapes but doesn't drive the transfer of resources.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at companies by market cap, yeah, I mean, number 1 right now is NVIDIA, 2 is Microsoft, 3 is Apple, 4 is Alphabet, aka Google, yeah. Amazon, 5 is Meta, 6 is broadband, 7 is Saudi America, 9 is TSMC, and then Tesla, which essentially is a mobile phone on wheels. People with all the data they're collecting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, wait, what is, if you take a look at that, basically, what is that? 8 out of the top 10 are essentially tech companies, which,
yeah,
I mean, 11's Oracle, and, of course, we all know about of that being a tech company. I mean, I agree with you that there's a lot of different components to it, but the internet just allows so much concentration.
Well, in the book, one of the things I talk about, of course, is lootable resources, which I see as one of the main creators of Goliath structures. So once you start to get resources that are easily seen, stolen, and stored, that allows you to start creating this big dominance hierarchy that also allows for the engine of inequality to start to kick in. And this is a good explainer for why we get states across certain parts of the world and not others, and importantly, why agriculture seems to be one of the commonality across states. But it's not just agriculture. Papua New Guinea has agriculture at the same time as Egypt does, roughly 7,000 years ago. But of course, it never starts to have pharaohs. It never starts to build pyramids. The key difference is Papua New Guinea has taro and bananas, which are resources which are both very difficult to store. They only last roughly 1 to 6 months. And in the case of taro, are also pretty invisible. They are underground, and you can leave them underground even after the harvest period. By comparison, all the resources are typically used for early Goliaths, wheat, corn, rice. They advertise themselves when they're ready to be harvested. They're very difficult to hide, and they're very easy to store. So they're very easily looted by a small elite and then kept for a growing surplus. And I make the case that in the modern world, our new form of lootable resource alongside agriculture and fossil fuels is data. Data is harvested en masse, and it's used to build these great empires, whether it's, of course, as you mentioned, NVIDIA, which is kind of more or less provide the infrastructure for data capture. You have to have microchips in order to actually capture data en masse. And Meta, Alphabet, Microsoft, etc. They're all firms that are pretty heavily involved in surveillance capitalism, which is all about harvesting and farming data. So data is the new form of little resource. In many ways, that explains the kind of economic composition of the richest companies today.
In your book, you talked about super forecasters, and you mentioned the book The Precipice with Toby Orb.
Yep.
And you basically said, like, I wouldn't listen to this guy. That was kind of the gist of it, is like, you got a bunch of these people make predictions. They're going to be wrong. Who really cares? But it is kind of interesting to see what he says, because this is your life. This is what you research. And just kind of talking about what are the biggest potential situations or events that will take out humanity. And at the highest he actually has is AI. Unaligned AI is a 1 in 10 chance. And this is 100-year, estimating risk for 100 years. Super volcanic eruption at 1 in 10,000, asteroid or comet, 1 in a million. Naturally occurring pandemic, 1 in 10,000. a nuclear war and fallout, which you talk heavily about in your book. He has 1 in 1,000. Engineered pandemic, 1 in 30, which we probably just came out of one, considering that I think like the US, CIA has said that is the whole COVID-19 most likely started in a laboratory in China with gain of function research, which you also talk about in your book as well. Now, whether that's true or not, obviously we don't know, but it's certainly a potentiality. Climate change, 1 in 1,000, and then the other unknowns is 1 in 50, which a lot of, I guess you could say unknowns. You don't know what you don't know, right? So that's 1 in 50, which is actually one of the higher ones on the list. But like I said, you kind of dismissed this in the book, but just hypothetically having fun here. What would you say about some of these risks as someone that's actually involved in this space yourself at a much, say, deeper level than Toby Ord?
It's worthwhile quickly discussing why I wouldn't take the numbers from Toby or anyone else really to heart. When we try to think about the future, we can do so through what's called forecasting or foresight. Forecasting is making a very precise numerical prediction about a future event. So, for instance, who is going to win the next soccer World Cup? Who's going to win the next presidential election in the US in 2028, etc. Foresight is more on painting a general plausible picture of how the future looks. And even science fiction, for instance, stuff says, 1984 is in some way an exercise in foresight. I think we can do foresight when it comes to these very large, long picture exercises, but I think we can't really do forecasting. There's not much evidence of that. The very best example we have of forecasting is what's called super forecasters. And this is a method which has won all the big tournaments run by the intelligence agencies when they try to think about how do we best predict geopolitical events. And they obviously have a huge incentive to try to find and pick the very best methods. And the best by far is super forecasters, pioneered by Philip Tetlock, where essentially you have a group of people who are trained to make forecasts, who are also tend to be just preternaturally good at making forecasts. They share a whole bunch of different characteristics. But basically, you do a tournament to find who's best. You put those super forecasters into a group. They then share information. They deliberate. They debate. They all update their predictions accordingly. And then you take essentially the average of their predictions. And then you adjust it ever so slightly using a machine learning algorithm. And that's by far the best method. And even that method, it doesn't have high accuracy. It tends to degrade exponentially after roughly a year. So super forecasters making predictions 10 years out, we don't really have any evidence that can be accurate. That gives me great skepticism that we can do this for, say, 50 to 100 years out, and for things which are incredibly unprecedented. Super forecasts are generally working with very precise events, and usually ones which have a higher track record to draw from as well. Trying to predict societal collapse or human extinction is almost the opposite. That being said, I think we can look at dynamics and understand what's going to lead to societal collapse in the long term. In the case of Toby, it's in a single individual who's making an estimate with, as far as we know, no deliberation. There's no super forecasters involved on probably the most complex long-term question possible. So there's just really no need to take it seriously. Apart from that, it's cool to think of like this list of, nuclear war, climate change, AI, and then debate about which one's most important. And there's some value to that, but what I put forward in the book is that these are all interconnected, both in their causes and their consequences. If you look at climate change, for instance, then roughly 4 degrees of warming or 3.5 degrees leads to heat domes of 29 degrees mean annual temperature, which basically the only areas which exist in that today don't have built up infrastructure or cities. That in the future will cover areas including 2 nuclear states, India and Pakistan, and 7 different biosafety level 4 facilities, those working on the world's most dangerous pathogens. So there's a link there in terms of consequences, and apart from that, all of them depend upon very similar resources. If you want to build, say, for instance, a large language model, or even a killer robot, you have to rely upon cobalt, which is mined in the DRC by people being paid a couple of dollars a day, often the worst conditions possible. If you want to have climate change, you need to have very cheap coal, once again, usually procured by people who are deeply underpaid across the world. Even nuclear weapons rely upon uranium. The world's very first uranium mine in Shinkolobwe, which was used to build the first atomic weapons of the Manhattan Project in the United States, was once again in the DRC, done by very, very cheap, exploited labor under the oversight of Belgian authorities. As soon as you take away mining and you actually start to pay the miners properly, suddenly a lot of existential risk properly isn't produced anymore. It's really difficult to kind of disentangle these things and think of them as like separate technological big threats. They're all part of an overarching system of risk. I don't think about this in terms of what's the risk of AI destroying the world or climate change. It's probably going to be a combination of things. Instead, I think, given the current global system, how much risk is it producing? How big is the overall chance of existential risk? And I don't try to give any precise numbers, and mainly because I think people would anchor far too heavy upon them. You know, people in local Toby's book, they say 1 in 6. That's his big prediction, 1 in 6 chance. We don't have any idea. And importantly, I don't want people to come away with the book thinking 1 in 3, 1 in 4, 1 in 6. I want them to come away from the book with the much more important message of wealth inequality and concentrations of power are the key drivers behind existential risk. And once you fix those, you start to address the underlying problem.
I learned that from your book, the DRC, which of course for people that aren't familiar with that acronym, of course, is the Congo. But they actually supplied, the mines in the Congo supplied the uranium for the atomic bombs that the U.S. dropped on Japan, which I never knew. I always just assumed the uranium came from mines in the U.S. So that was actually quite fascinating. And then anyway, since we're speaking of Toby Ord, I decided I'm at tobyord.com. And this I find to be quite interesting. Just says that he's a senior researcher at Oxford University's AI governance initiative. So his paycheck depends on him governing AI, happens to actually have AI as the biggest risk at 1 in 10, destroying the world or whatever. So, I mean, is he biased? I don't know, but I would say, because obviously I can't get into his head, but I would say I would have certainly trepidation with that job title and his prediction of 1 in 10 for all the things that could possibly destroy the world.
I have a lot of problems with the precipice. In Toby's defense, he did publish it initially when he was at the Future of Med Institute, which is a bit broader than AI. It still has a pretty big AI focus. But that being said, there is a very big problem in the field of existential risk and in general of people swapping over from researching into working for the companies who are actually trying to build AI systems. And their defense would be, well, we think this is a huge risk, and we need to make sure that we're the ones who are helping to govern this risk and decrease it. And the best way to do so is actually working with those who are creating it. If I want to have the biggest impact on stopping AI, it's going to be working with DeepMind and OpenAI. I think that is a brutally, fundamentally flawed strategy. I think, as you mentioned, it can lead to certain biases. It's really hard to, talk ill of your company or your colleagues when you're actually embedded in it. You start to have the problem of your paycheck is dependent upon actually building these systems in the first place. And additionally, I think most of these companies just don't really have much of an interest in actually creating safe AI, or more importantly, even just, of course, not building AI systems in the first place. I put forward pretty important evidence that Anthropic, DeepMind, OpenAI, all their CEOs have talked about AI being a potential cause of human extinction. Some of them give wildly high estimates. For instance, Dario Modo has an even higher estimate than Toby Ord that AI will kill everyone. He thinks it's roughly, I believe it was a top of 25% chance, a 1 in 4 chance that AI kills literally everyone by the end of the century. There's obviously still the interesting case of him still trying to build it, but you could say, well, he's trying to build an aligned, safe AI. The problem is Anthropic, DeepMind, OpenAI, they've all continuously lobbied against any kind of legislation that would actually improve the situation and create safe AI systems. A great example being the bill SB 1047 in California, which is basically supposed to hold particularly large frontier AI models to account for catastrophic outcomes. That was lobbied very heavily against, including by Anthropic and others, and eventually was vetoed by the governor at the time, Gavin Newsom. Similarly, the Big Beautiful Bill, as Trump called it, that initially had a clause for having a memorandum. So literally no AI legislation was allowed at a state level for the next 10 years, the next decade. Again, it was big AI companies who were pushing for that. It's pretty hard to say you think there's an extinction risk while also lobbying against regulating that extinction risk. And yet that's exactly what is happening. So I don't think these companies take the risk seriously. I think their business model's built upon creating it in the first place. Hence, I think trying to work inside of them or allying with them is a very, very poor strategy. But it's one that a lot of my colleagues take.
Well, and also, like you mentioned in the book, I mean, when you're talking about Sam Altman or any of these other AI CEOs, it's just marketing, right? AI is a marketing term. You want to make this technology seem a lot more powerful than it is. You get more investor money from VCs, and then you put yourself on the governing board as a way to regulate your competitors out of existence and kind of keep your monopoly position. If you really think that you're going to destroy not just the world, but yourself, your family, your friends, you're probably not pushing forward as hard on this as they're trying to. So, yeah, I mean, I guess you kind of, what's the whole expression, actions speak louder than words.
Precisely. In economics, we call it revealed preferences. People's actions and also how much they're willing to pay for certain things shows where their interests clearly lie rather than their rhetoric necessarily. In the case of Sam Altman, for instance, he's talked a lot about how AI could kill everyone or lead to enslavement of humans by machines. Yet, as you've said, he still goes ahead and tries to build it. In this stage, OpenAI's entire business model is more or less dependent upon building an advanced artificial intelligence system. If they don't, the entire venture capital bubble bursts. They're hemorrhaging money right now, and the way they plan on making that money back is by building the most advanced system possible. And importantly, if I really felt this was going to kill everyone, I'd surely want to stop it. And if you're someone like Altman, it's really difficult to say he can't have any kind of chance of at the very least slowing down the development of these systems. He's one of the most well-connected, richest people on earth. And you're telling me that if he took a public stand and said, we can't build this at any cost, I'm going to personally put all my money, time, effort, and lobbying prowess towards not building this, that it wouldn't have some kind of impact. And importantly, at the very least, he wouldn't be contributing to the problem. A good, I think, kind of moral exemplar to work on here is we tend to remember people like, of course, the builders of atomic weapons, people like Edward Teller, for instance, Oppenheimer being the most famously known one now. Very few people know of Joseph Rotblat, who was a physicist working the atomic bomb, who then stopped working on it once he realized just how devastating it could be and that Nazis were no longer building their own bomb. He dropped out of the program out of good conscience and became one of the world's leading activists of nuclear disarmament, one of the world's leading scholars on nuclear disarmament. Rotblat is the kind of person we need more of in the modern world, not Oppenheimer.
Since we're on this AI topic right now, I think you and I are both probably in agreement that we're not going to have robots, enslaving people, at least in our lifetime, right? That technology is not there. Like the whole movie Terminator and Skynet is not going to happen. However, with what we currently have, you keep talking about surveillance capitalism. The technology that we do have, though, is already, is powerful. So this is a quote from your book that I find it to be interesting. Again, you're talking about the biggest threat of AI. And you say that, quote, AI, it accelerates the creation of global catastrophic risk, arm races, and military operations, whether it be the race to a bigger swarm of autonomous armed drones or deciding which families to drop bombs on, get speeded up. The hunger of the global economy for data, energy, and resources will deepen. The need for more and more data for better algos will drive mass surveillance. While thermonuclear war or engineered pandemics could directly cause collapse, this AI accelerant is closer to a collapse by 1,000 cuts. It's the equivalent of pouring a tank of petrol, or in the US, gasoline, onto an inferno. So, I mean, like you're basically saying AI isn't the end all, but it certainly could provide with, like you mentioned, 1,000 cuts. Let's just say the current iteration of ChatGPT 5 and the current AI systems we have now is maxed out as you essentially postulate.
Mm.
What would that mean for the world, even if this iteration is kind of peak AI, quote unquote, so to speak?
Yes, it's worthwhile taking a step back and specifying what are people worried about when they think about AI being a direct threat to humanity. And the big idea here is superintelligence, that once you have a sufficiently capable algorithm that can code better than most software engineers, it can then self-improve. It can basically make a better version of itself. It can then create an even better version of that self. And you create a kind of positive feedback loop of what some would call an intelligence explosion, until eventually get a machine that is so powerful and so intelligent that it makes even the most intelligent person look very, very dumb by comparison. It's orders of magnitude more intelligent than any of us across multiple different domains. This machine that can't just do image recognition or spatial navigation with a robot. It can do everything, basically. It's generalized. And the notion is that if we build something like that, it'll be very difficult to make sure it's aligned with our interests. The very typical example given here, which is kind of funny, is the idea of a paperclip maximizer. You tell the superintelligence to maximize paperclips, and it looks around and says, well, all the molecules that make up humans and make up Earth could be turned into paperclips, and I'm going to do so. So it basically destroys the entire Earth, making paperclips, then expands across the entire cosmos to make more and more paperclips. I am more skeptical of this idea of superintelligence directly causing human extinction. I can't rule it out, and in the book I don't. I think it's still something we should take seriously, and I'm an advocate, for instance, of just trying to build these machines. It's something we don't know if we could reach and in what time frame. I'm skeptical it will happen for a range of reasons. As mentioned in the book, I don't think AI development's really slowing down yet, but there are certain things which could slow it down. For instance, a lack of data. Already probably this year or next year, we'll be running out of data and have to rely increasingly upon synthetic data created by AI machines. A lack of energy. There's just a huge amount of energy required to actually build the data centers for these machines. It's hard to keep up with that. And there also just could be just simple problems of the architecture, which just don't allow us to get towards artificial general intelligence, what I call automated cognition in the book. I still think it is this big problem, as you mentioned, this kind of accelerant force. And we can see this in the world today. You mentioned Skynet, and while there's no Skynet like in the movie Terminator, there actually was, and I believe still is, a program called Skynet being used in Pakistan, which is essentially an algorithm for collecting different types of data from people who are being surveilled in Pakistan, looking at their movement patterns, their mobile phone calls, who they're meeting with. That all gets fed into an algorithm to determine who's most likely a terrorist or aiding and abetting terrorists. And then that gets fed into decisions of who basically launch a drone strike on. Israel's using a very similar system called Lavender in the case of Gaza. So AI is already being used to basically speed up and increasingly take humans out of decision-making processes when it comes to things like military operations. And when we look at Ukraine and Russia, we also see even human fighters being increasingly replaced by swarms of AI autonomous weapons. Basically swarms of armed drones, more or less, who can sometimes make their own decisions, including on who to kill. And in many ways, you can think of AIs as being an amplifier of our institutions. If our institutions are largely building catastrophic risk, AI is going to speed that up. It's going to amplify that. If we have institutions which are mainly focused upon, say, for instance, improving people's attention spans, making democracy deeper, increasing human connection, AI could help with those things, but we don't live in that world. We don't live in a world in which most governments are mainly concerned with democracy or improving people's happiness. As we see, it's mainly a business model being built upon things like surveillance and, of course, the attention economy.
Two of the biggest themes of your book, one we talked about inequality, the other is the concept of democracy. And I'll read this other quote from your book, which I found to be quite interesting. And this is, I mean, you talk about this a lot, but I found of all the quotes on democracy, this is probably one of the more succinct ones, which is basically what you say, or you're right, what we ordinarily call democracy, systems in which a subset of people who are aggressively propagandized by political marketers and billionaire-owned media empires vote every 4 to 5 years for a tiny number usually rich representatives who are funded and lobbied by corporations for whom they frequently work afterwards. Of course, that's, the revolving door, who then enact policies which usually better represent elite interests than popular opinion, is better described as oligarchy with democratic furnishings. It's far more inclusive than most governments throughout history, but that is a low bar compared to what is possible. Even this democracy right now is being frayed by increasing wealth inequality, and it's no coincidence that with a slight time lag, that democracy started backsliding after inequality began rising across the world in the 1970s. So, I mean, do you, even in democratic countries, then, do you think that we don't even have an actual legit democracy? Like the US, again, I'm not living in England like you are, but I know in the US, most people refer to our political system as the uniparty. Doesn't matter if you vote for a Democrat or a Republican, you're still essentially voting for one person that has the interest of whatever elites we have at this particular time that we're voting for. And I think that was one of the reasons that a lot of the mass media, I mean, people can hate Trump all they want, but he also kind of went outside of the typical political parties that are picked by the Democrats and the Republicans. It's why they have like the never Trumpers. It's Republicans that didn't want Trump because he wasn't actually part of their quote unquote like inner circle. But do you like think that pretty much every country that has a democracy in the world actually kind of has this, like, okay, you got option A, option B, and they're essentially two sides of the same coin?
So there's three big problems with the way we talk about and think about democracy today. One is that we only talk about democracy when it comes to decision making in the government. Most of us will vote one in every 4 years, at least if you're living in an advanced democracy. But we then often work in autocracies. We spend 9 to 5 in governance structures where basically one person, often the CEO, is making pretty autocratic decisions, which are enforced upon the rest of us. We bet in stock markets, which are pretty autocratic and which is usually only a small number of very big firms who control most of the market, for instance. Most of life is pretty autocratic. I mean, even schools, for instance, were originally modeled off factory lines. It's kind of hard to call a society democratic if most of its systems of governance are actually autocratic, but people get to vote one every 4 years. And as you mentioned, all the other caveats of the politicians going for a revolving door, etc. The second is that democracy is always a spectrum of more or less inclusive practices with more or less deliberation and information. And where you draw a line and say this is democracy is always going to be a bit of a judgment call. And unfortunately, the one line we've decided to draw is basically, do you have a parliamentary democracy like the one that the UK had when it started colonizing the world? And that's one version of having a parliamentary democracy. There's many others. Barcelona, for instance, very early on, had a system which you had democratic representatives, but they had to be informed by an assembly of what their mandate was. And if they strayed too far from that mandate, they could be executed. That's a very different type of democracy. And one could say it's actually much more intense as well. Obviously, ancient Athens, totally different. One I actually prefer is a democracy by sortition, in which people are selected at random and then placed into key decision-making roles for a short period of time. And interestingly, the Greeks themselves would think of democracy as being about sortition and lottery, and they thought of voting as being oligarchy. And the third big problem here is it doesn't think about what are the actual consequences that are being of the decisions and which decisions are actually democratic. Most decisions about the military are not democratic at all, even in advanced democracies, because we have no fucking clue what's going on in the military most of the time. And when you look at the US, for instance, Elaine Scarry, a nuclear scholar, has termed it a thermonuclear monarchy, because the decision to launch a nuclear weapon, the decision to start a nuclear war, potentially to end global society, can be made by a single person. Donald Trump can make the decision to start a nuclear war. It doesn't require any sign-off from Congress, the Senate, or any other wider group of individuals. As long as those he commands follow orders, he could start a nuclear war today if he wanted to. It's pretty hard to call that system with the most consequential decision ever of humans being centralized into one person, to call that democratic seems like a bit of a stretch. For me, I wouldn't call most of our systems today democratic. We're living in one single global Goliath where autocracy is the main rule.
Since we were talking about some of the themes of the book, of course, we talked about inequality. Then we also talked about, as we're talking now, like, hey, maybe we don't actually, our definition of democracy and what the actual application of democracy is maybe not aligned with what we think. And then the third big theme was collapse is ultimately the great leveler. You talk about ultimately these societies get too unequal, or you end up having, people are oppressed, or whatever the reason may be. Maybe even it could be a climate change, maybe a drought or a flood wiped them out. But then these people end up moving out and they form their own new cities, new villages, new societies that are ultimately kind of from scratch. They're more equal. You don't have the elites with leverage, especially like before, like the lootable resources. Even if you had lootable resources, if all these things were destroyed and then collapsed, everyone's kind of on a level playing field. And maybe it goes back into the four turning, where then you're back kind of at the first turning, where everyone's back at square one, so to speak. And you mentioned like a lot of these numbers where it's like, oh, this civilization had 90% death. And it's like, well, actually, no, these people just like, yeah, some people died. A bunch of people just end up moving on and starting different civilizations, as you mentioned. And one of the big other themes is that history is generally written by the top 1% of society. Like, what's the whole expression? History is written by the victors, and generally, who are the victors? It's not just the victors, it's the elite of the victors. So it's the 1%. Maybe it's even the 1% of the 1% of the 1% is actually, I mean, you're talking about like literacy. How many people were actually able to even read and write 4,000 years ago? This is the elite of the elite. So who actually is the one even writing the history that we have? So it's a pretty narrow kind of picture that we're seeing to begin with. But ultimately, what my point overall is, if you want to talk about how collapse doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, especially considering it's not like it's a mass, die off, so to speak, but it could just be a mass exodus. And like you mentioned, exit options, the ability to start anew.
In the book, I define collapse as being a rapid and enduring contraction fragmentation of power structures. And as you mentioned, that naturally leads to a leveling of power structures. And that means that people who often weren't benefiting from, or were even actively being oppressed by power structures, can sometimes benefit. Collapse is a process with winners and losers, costs and benefits. And we tended to overemphasize and exaggerate the costs. You mentioned often these really big figures of, 70% or 90% of the population was lost. And the problem is that often archaeologically, it's really hard to tell the difference between someone who moved, particularly into a lifestyle which leaves less of a trace. Say, for instance, moving from a city onto a farm where most of what you're using is made of wood. It degrades really easily. It doesn't leave a trace in the archaeological record. It's really hard to tell that sometimes. And it's really hard to tell even, for instance, how many people were living at certain periods of time in history. The estimates for the population of Rome often vary from 20 million to 60 million type of thing. So it's really hard to get a really precise grapple on how many people are dying. And if there was a difference between dying and moving, when you look at civil wars today, roughly 20 to 30 times more people move and are displaced than die. And there's not much reason to believe that's changed dramatically today in comparison to the past. So I think we're likely exaggerating just how bad collapses were in terms of mortality, or certainly ones which were terrible. But also there were a whole bunch of benefits as well. So I talk about the case of Somalia, for instance, in the modern world, in which 1991, the Bahrain regime falls apart. And a decade later, maternal mortality dropped by 30%. Then infant mortality by 24% and extreme poverty by 20%. That's true of the most of quality of life indicators in Somalia. It's just in general a better place to live than under the Bahrain regime. And it's getting better even in comparison to its more stable political neighbors. That's something which we see throughout history. Even in the case of the Western Empire, people get taller and they seem to be healthier with less bone lesions, trauma on the bones, and less holes in their teeth, less dental cavities after the fall of Rome. And granted, there's a lot of variation across areas. So you're probably worse off potentially if you live in the UK, for instance. You live in Rome and Britain. But in general, lots of people actually benefited. And it's not just because so many people died or more resources left over. People outside the Roman Empire were also taller than those who were inside the empire. The old trope of the muscle-bound barbarian is pretty much true. And it kind of makes sense, given that by the end, Rome had crippling taxation. It was offering very little to its citizens in terms of public benefits, and it was 3/4 the way towards the maximum theoretical level of inequality. That maximum being a situation in which one individual takes all the surplus resources and everyone else has just enough to get by to essentially survive and reproduce. Rome was 75% of the way there. Hence, it was often a good thing for a lot of people to suddenly not have the empire leering over them. But again, it's important to remember there's a lot of variation here. If you, for instance, are in the city of Rome, you endure 2 sackings, a huge depopulation of the city no longer gets free grain from Egypt, etc. Life changes quite a lot. The same can be said of Rome and Britain as well. If you're a peasant living in Spain, you probably don't notice too much apart from your tax collector suddenly starts speaking a different language and maybe demanding a bit less.
So, Luke, as your book is called Goliath's Curse, the history and future of societal collapse, do you think overall the global Goliath is in an okay position? You know, right now, let's say you're in college, you're going to university, you got a lot of people telling you like, oh, AI is going to take your job. You're going to have all this student debt, not be able to get a job. We already hear about how a lot of Gen Zs don't have a lot of soft skills, so to speak. Or, I mean, there's a lot of markers that also show the world is improving. We have a lot less people growing up in poverty. We have a lot more literacy, a lot more women around the world have a lot more freedom. We have a lot more choice on fertility and things like that. So, and I mean, not to mention, there's people, you know, even like the UN talks about how I think what is in 2060, 2080, we're going to actually start having population decline instead of population rising like we've had for millennia. So what would be the conversation that you would have with some of these young people, and how would you position yourself going forward based on your work with risk and societies?
Much will depend upon what you want to do in the world, of course. If you just want to simply make money and have a job, that's a very different conversation in comparison to if you want to actively make the world a better place. In the book, I try to trace out some general trajectories that the global Goliath today could take. And I think in the short term, we're likely to head towards what I call the Silicon Goliath, essentially a system of increasing autocracy and mass surveillance. As mentioned, data becomes a new literal resource. We cage people in their land through things like mass surveillance. And it may still be a world of actually some level of increasing material comfort and standard of living, maybe. But even if you have that, it's a world which is far less free and far less democratic. And if people, particularly in the West, for instance, if we really cherish those values, that should be a world we don't necessarily welcome. I do think in the long term, over the space of decades or centuries, the most likely is self-termination, that the global Goliath eventually results in either global societal collapse or something worse. And that's just as simple as if you have arms races over the long term with improving technology, where does it end? You can't rely upon nuclear deterrence or deterrence of any type to just hold out for that long. You can't rely upon being lucky for that long. And similarly, if you're constantly taking more resources and you're having a race to the bottom in terms of, say, for instance, regulation, where does that end in the long term? You can't rely upon a plucky techno fix always solving the new problems being created by extracting resources and pumping more pollution into the environment. Hence, my advice to young people today would be essentially try to be heroic, try to actually shift the trajectory onto one which is more democratic, which is more about the emancipation of people and everything else. And that would probably be, I mean, there's lots of different ways to do it. It could be by becoming a researcher, it could be by becoming an activist. It could be just pursuing the usual kind of mundane day-to-day things like being a teacher, a nurse, a doctor. We need those people, of course. They provide enormous social benefits. But making sure in your personal conduct, whether it be your voting patterns, how you're involved in politics, even how you run your family, are just as democratic as possible, that you're trying to basically chip away at Goliath one little stroke at a time. In the book, I try to put forward a whole bunch of both personal and wider recommendations of how to do that. And I guess that would be the biggest advice to people would be try to be more democratic, try to do jobs that are going to actively help the world escape from these Goliath traps like arms races and races for resources. And the last piece of advice I have is pretty simple. Don't be a dick. Don't work for firms and companies which are directly creating global societal collapse. Don't work, for instance, for leading AI firms like OpenAI, Google, DeepMind, etc. And don't work for fossil fuel companies, arms manufacturers. And in general, just try to, where possible, as mentioned, be democratic. Don't dominate others. If you can, don't be psychopathic or a narcissist in your actions. That would be the kind of main points of advice I have. I'm not going to go too much into trying to be a seer or predict the economy or give people job advice. That's outside my realm.
Reading your book, which is I think like 462 pages when you take out the notes and the acknowledgments, etc. But one of the big themes, I think, if I were to, of course, I'm putting words in your mouth, but from reading 462 pages of your book, I would say that if you had to put your threat at the highest level, would be nuclear weapons, and then combined with AI. Well, let's just say hypothetically, as you mentioned, some system fails. You mentioned about the story in Russia in the 1980s, but basically you have a nuclear blast, whether it's an AI system gone rogue, someone, or maybe just, again, some person misinterprets something and they think they're under attack when they're not because the systems are down or some other system is down. And as you basically mentioned in the book, that one of these big blasts, because these weapons are like 10,000 times more powerful than what was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in the 1940s, that all of a sudden now you have essentially like this nuclear blast could act like a super volcano. So you mentioned how we could have a 10 degrees Celsius drop in global temperature. And that 10 degrees Celsius to, in the US, that's 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So now all of a sudden, the actual land that you can grow plants and grow crops is actually shrunking down. So now you have way less room to grow crops to live, but you also have animals that have way less area where they're able to live, so they then migrate. So now you have the concentration of animals and humans. Now all of a sudden you have different diseases because of all the close so it's not necessarily that the nuclear blast killed you, but now it could be all of a sudden now you're going to die of starvation. And all of a sudden we have all these new diseases because of all the different interactions that aren't natural. And of course, then you get people in society. Now maybe you have more conflict over resources. So like, it's just kind of a combination. But to me, and again, maybe this is just my interpretation. This is how I read your book. So you can kind of clarify. That's the beauty of talking to the actual author, where he's like, well, actually, no, but 462 pages, I feel like I have a pretty good grasp of what you said. So, how would you kind of, am I wrong with that? Am I right? What would you say to that, I guess?
I'd say you're both wrong and right. If we're trying to think about this purely in terms of individual threats that could end global society in the coming decade or two, don't say it's definitely nuclear weapons. That's definitely the most worrisome for me. But for me, one of the key things I try to do in the book is move beyond the idea of thinking about existential risk or global societal collapse as being just about individual hazards, about big shocks like nuclear weapons, AI, climate change, etc. And instead think about what's the overall system that's producing it and where does that come from? In the book, I talk about these as root causes. What are the key things that are causing existential risk and the risk of global societal collapse in the long term? And I point towards a whole bunch of psychological factors. We don't have to get too deep into those because the key thing is what they result in. And that is 3 different things: arms races, races for resources, and races for status. Even if we, say, for instance, had some kind of amazing diplomatic outcome, which resulted in nuclear weapon stockpiles being reduced to 0, if we managed to do the incredible act of having complete nuclear disarmament, I'm skeptical that over the next 200 years, we wouldn't find another way to have an arms race over some kind of other weaponry, where it's, say, for instance, bombardment through orbital lasers, or of course, lethal autonomous weapons. There's a constant pursuit by militaries to find new, more dangerous weapons that give them an advantage. In the long term, if you don't fix that, you can end up with something which is probably equivalent to nuclear weapons. Unless you find a way to fix that underlying driver of risk, you're still likely screwed in the long term. And interestingly, that was the genesis in many ways of me moving into this field. I was originally researching the governance of climate change in particular, and till I realized that, well, even if we reduced emissions to zero and managed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, if we do that by 2050, but you had a nuclear war in 2051, you're still screwed, unfortunately. Hence, I do think nuclear wars is the most pressing short-term hazard that could cause global societal collapse. Yet, ultimately, if we want to have an assured, prosperous, long-term future for humanity, then we need to address the underlying problems, and that means getting past these races for status, resources, and arms. And it's worthwhile noting, actually, I call them races because it's easier to explain. In many cases, they're not really races. Most militaries of the world actively trade weapons with each other, for instance. The Israeli government approved the sale of what's called Pegasus, probably the most potent surveillance weapon, one of the most potent surveillance weapons available, which is developed by an Israeli group called the NSO Group. The Israeli government then approved sales to places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, countries who are supposed to be their very worst enemies, apparently. But so often these are closer to rackets. The pursuit of arms races isn't just because countries are competing, it's also because there's a whole bunch of companies and militaries who get an enormous amount of privilege, but more importantly, profit from the pursuit.
Your epilogue certainly provides some what you think are solutions to kind of not falling into, no people left the planet Earth because we have some massive event or whatnot. So what would be some of the solutions that you think that we, not just solutions, but actually solutions that are implementable, that are, say, realistic, that we can move towards the next decade or so?
The technical solutions, which are at least technically feasible and could be done within the next decade or so, there's quite a few of those for reducing existential risk. There's nothing stopping us from disarming nuclear weapons. And in the 1990s, that was done pretty rapidly. I think at roughly the pace of 1,000 every couple of years. Similarly, we know when it comes to climate change that we can reduce emissions. Every major economy has what's called a pathway to deep decarbonization, essentially a roadmap for using either existing or soon-to-be existing technology to reach net zero emissions. There's nothing that's really stopping us from doing those things per se. And in general, I view most of this as just making the economy much more honest. Right now, firms and companies, whether building nuclear weapons or pumping of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, they're imposing a very big cost upon the world. That's both long-term costs, the threat of climate change, for instance, the damages that will cause, but also short-term. 9 to 12 million people die every year because of carbon-based pollution. Once you start to factor in those costs, suddenly it's far less profitable to be a fossil fuel company or be an arms manufacturer, for instance. And all that is, once again, is just simply making the economy more honest. It's making the social and environmental costs that firms produce be paid by them and not by either us or, of course, future generations. Naturally, people say that might be technically feasible, but it's not politically feasible. And that's almost a golden rule, is that anything that is effective at reducing the risk of collapse will not be politically feasible. And ultimately, if we want to have a lasting change that will reduce the risk of global societal collapse, I think we start to have to level the different sources of social power. We have to more or less reverse the process that usually causes collapse, which is the accumulation of power in a smaller number of individuals. Pretty easy, and once again, a technical sense, insofar as we know how to do this when it comes to economics. We just have more progressive taxation, have wealth taxes, even have caps on wealth. There's no reason someone should have more than $10 million. That's not going to result in a better quality of life or them being happier, but it will certainly result in them having a greater ability to erode democracy and control of people. When it comes to politics, pretty easy. Just have more democracy. And in particular, I'd point towards things like open democracy, deliberative democracy, where you basically have small groups of citizens who are selected at random, they're informed by experts, and then they make policy choices. And there's a growing body of evidence that these tend to make far better decisions than the usual approach of having elected representatives in a parliamentary democracy. And importantly, they're buffered from being influenced by corporations. They don't have a chance to go and do the revolving door afterwards. So you start to get rid of corruption, the influence of corporate donors. And importantly, you start to select just at random for everyday people rather than our current system where we select for people who want power and status the most, which means we tend to also select for people who are high in psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. So that would be one way of leveling power, and I think you can do that in the corporate sector as well. You can start to democratize things and have more both worker-owned cooperatives, but also things that actually have citizens' juries sitting on top of the CEO board. And I put forward basically a set of different interventions across the realm to level all the different sources of social power. And I think that's key, that ultimately, if you want to have a long-term future for humanity, you have to find a way to level power and make the world more democratic. But the beauty here is that we should want to have a world in which fewer people die from pollution, a world in which we have cleaner rivers, a world in which we have more democracy and freedom. And the beauty is that doing so is going to make the world safer as well. In short, democracy can help save the world.
Yeah, I like your idea about basically, having people selected at random, and then of course having term limits. Because I think the biggest whether again you're a Democrat or a Republican in the U.S., the fact is you have career politicians, and they're more concerned about getting reelected and actually keeping their donors happy than they are about the population at large, the people that actually elected them. It's the whole, broken promises, say whatever to get elected and then don't follow through. Insider trading is illegal for these people. There's no reason that you should be making $150,000 a year and worth $100 million, a decade or 2 decades later. I mean, that's asinine. I think that's actually probably the most implementable, but then of course, who's going to have to sign off on it? Well, probably the politicians that would be affected by it, which means that it won't happen. But I feel like it's an easy solution, but the actual implementation of creating that is a lot more difficult.
And this is unfortunately going to be true across the board, is that trying to change power structures and trying to level power is going to go against the interests of the powerful. As you mentioned, open democracy will face the problem that existing politicians don't want to give up their power, even if they think it will result in a better world. If you try to, for instance, impose wealth taxes, it's pretty obvious who will oppose that. Billionaires and the rich who have far more than $10 million. If you try to impose, say, for instance, greater oversight in the military and create new solutions to get around arms races, who's going to push back on that? Well, first of all, the big arms manufacturers, places like Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, but also many of the militaries as well. In short, it's going to be a battle against power. And you said an important thing before, which is the world has improved in many ways. We have over 80% literacy here across the world. We've eradicated things like smallpox. People have been getting taller as well, which suggests greater caloric consumption. People are healthier overall. There's a lot of things to be thankful for. That being said, it hasn't happened just because of technology or because of enlightenment, as Steve Pinker pointed towards. In the industrial core of the UK during the Industrial Revolution, people don't de facto get healthier. Actually, life expectancy and even human height drop quite a lot. You don't start to get big progress. You don't start to get healthier, happier people with more resources until you get big movements like the suffragettes movement, like unions, and even anarchists sometimes. Different groups who basically push against power structures and demand a wider redistribution of resources and power. It's not until you start to get those, you start to see these engines of progress kick in, the world become a better place. The same is unfortunately going to be true of the future as well, that not just preventing global societal collapse, but making a better world in general will require power struggle. And while I think it's going to be incredibly difficult and perhaps even unlikely, it's still something that's worth doing.
So today's guest has been Dr. Luke Kemp. He's the author of the new book, Goliath's Curse, The History and Future of Societal Collapse. So Luke, just 2 final questions. One, where can people get a hold of your new book, Goliath's Curse? Any other of your research papers? And then finally leave us with a closing thought related to this podcast, something you're working on next, or something we didn't discuss that you want to leave us with?
Where can you get my book? Essentially any major bookstore, and even the small independent ones. And I usually recommend that people try to get them from the small independent ones. It's once again called Goliath's Curse, The History and Future of Societal Collapse. You can also follow me on Substack under @LKemp. I'm on both Mastodon and Blue Sky @LukeKemp. And I unfortunately don't have a big repository of all my articles and research, etc. I am working on a website which should be up in the next few weeks. I'll have to check, but it should be something like www.luke/kemp.com. But I can send that through to you once it's complete. And apart from that, one final thought is my next book is on mass surveillance. It's got a working title, but it'll be essentially on the history and future of mass surveillance and societal control. And in many ways, this is intimately intertwined with global catastrophic risk, with societal collapse. As mentioned, if we're trying to stop these things in the long term, it's going to require power struggle, and it's going to require people engaging in political action, often engaging in direct action. And what we're seeing across the world, in places like the UK and the US, is an enormous crackdown on people protesting, people taking any kind of direct action against government. And of course, we're seeing a big rollout of increasing surveillance. And we spoke about real preferences earlier today, and I think it's pretty obvious that even for Western democracies, they're spending at least 100 times more on surveillance technologies than they are on improving democracy. That's revealed preference right there. And that's going to be one of the biggest struggles we have in the short term, is trying to reverse the push of surveillance and allow for greater acts of demonstration and protest.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.